The clockmaker who stopped time in the town of Hollowmere. Every clock had stopped at the same minute. Not broken, not run down, simply stopped. All of them. At exactly 7 minutes past midnight, on a night 8 years ago that the townspeople rarely spoke of anymore. The church bell no longer rang the hour. The mill clock's hands had frozen mid-tick, one pointing at the 7, one at the 12. Even the small clocks inside people's homes, the ones nobody thought to connect to anything, had gone still that same night and never moved again. There was only one clockmaker left in Hollowmere who could have fixed any of them. He did not fix them. He had not touched a single gear in 8 years. His name was Tobias Quill, and he lived above his old shop on Cooper's Lane, where a sign reading Quill's Clocks and Curiosities still hung outside, swinging slightly in the wind, though the shop itself had not opened in all that time. People in Hollowmere had grown used to telling time by other means. By the position of the sun. By the baker's bread, which always finished at roughly the same point in the morning. By the particular ache in their joints that told the older townsfolk it was nearly time for rain. It was inconvenient. But it was bearable. The way grief becomes bearable, eventually, if you build enough small habits around the hole it leaves. No one asked Tobias to fix the clocks. Not after the first year, when people had still tried. They had learned, by then, what the 7 minutes past midnight meant to him. And they had decided, out of a kind of rough collective mercy, to simply let him keep his town frozen, since it seemed to be the only thing keeping him upright at all. But there was a boy who did not know any of this. His name was Pim. He was 9 years old. Newly arrived in Hollowmere with his mother, who had taken a position at the mill and had not yet learned all the town's unspoken rules. Pim noticed the stopped clocks within his first week. He found it strange rather than sad, the way children often find strangeness more interesting than tragic. And he asked his mother why nobody had fixed them. Some things in this town you don't ask about, she told him, which, to a boy like Pim, was approximately the same as being told exactly where to go looking. He found Quill's Clocks and Curiosities on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The windows were filmed with dust thick enough to draw shapes in. Through the glass, Pim could see dozens of clocks lining the walls. Grandfather clocks, mantel clocks. Small ornate clocks shaped like birds and ships, every single one of them frozen at the same impossible minute. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Longer this time, the way children knock when they have decided a thing is going to happen regardless of what the adults inside might prefer. The door opened just enough for a thin shaft of dim light to fall across the dusty front step. A man stood there. He was not old, not the ancient, white-bearded clockmaker Pim had half expected from the old, sagging shop. He looked perhaps 40, but worn in a way that had nothing to do with years. His eyes had the flat, careful stillness of someone watching something happen very far away. "Shop's closed," said Tobias. "I didn't come to buy a clock," said Pim. "I came to ask why they're all stopped." Something moved behind Tobias's eyes. Not quite anger, not quite pain. Something more like a man being asked to touch a bruise he'd spent years protecting. "Go home," he said, and began to close the door. "My mum says everyone in this town has decided not to ask you that," said Pim quickly, before the gap could fully close. "But I think that's a strange way to be kind to someone. Just leaving them alone with the worst thing that ever happened to them, forever." The door stopped. It did not open further, but it stopped. "What's your name?" Tobias asked, after a long silence. "Pim." "Go home, Pim," said Tobias, but his voice had lost some of its sharpness. "It's not a story for you. Everyone keeps saying that," said Pim. "About everything interesting. This, for reasons Tobias could not entirely explain, even to himself, made him laugh. A short, rusty sound, like a hinge being used for the first time in years. He opened the door the rest of the way. Inside, the shop smelled of oil and old brass and dust that had settled so thoroughly it had become part of the furniture. Every surface held a clock. Every clock held the same frozen time. The collective silence of dozens of stopped mechanisms was somehow louder than ticking would have been. A held breath stretched across 8 years. "Sit," said Tobias, gesturing to a stool that had clearly not been sat on in a very long time. Pim sat. He looked around at the clocks with open curiosity rather than fear, the way he looked at most things. "I had an apprentice," Tobias said, without being asked. Apparently he had decided, somewhere in the act of opening the door, that he was finally going to tell this. "A girl named Ran. Sharp as anything. Better hands for small mechanisms than I had at twice her age. She'd been with me 3 years, since she was 11. He picked up a small disassembled clock from his workbench, turning it over in his fingers without really looking at it. The unconscious motion of hands that had done such work for decades and didn't know how to be entirely still. The night the clock stopped, there was a storm. A bad one. The kind that floods the low road by the river. Wren had gone to deliver a finished clock to a farm out past the mill, and she was meant to be back well before dark. She wasn't. "No," said Tobias. "I told myself the storm had simply delayed her. I told myself this for hours, sitting right here, fixing other people's clocks, because it was easier than walking out into the rain to look for her. I kept thinking, just 1 more hour, she'll be back any moment. There's no sense both of us getting soaked." His hands had gone still on the workbench. At 7 minutes past midnight, I finally went out to look. I don't know why that exact minute broke whatever spell of waiting I'd put myself under. But I remember looking at the shop clock as I left. Out of habit. The way you check the time before going anywhere. And it said 7 past 12. What happened? "I found her shawl caught on the low bridge railing, near the river," said Tobias. "The water had come up fast and high that night. There was no sign of her. Not that night. Not in the days after. Not ever." Pim was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the particular careful seriousness children bring to things they understand are very large and very sad. "And the clocks stopped that same minute," he said slowly. "All of them. Everywhere. I don't entirely understand it myself," said Tobias. "I've turned it over for 8 years. The closest I've come to an answer is this. I think time only moves forward, because people agree, mostly without noticing, to keep moving forward with it. And that night, I simply stopped agreeing. I stopped at 7 past midnight, and I never started again. Maybe the town stopped with me, because enough people loved her too, in their own ways, and grief doesn't always ask permission before it spreads. Or maybe," said Pim, with the blunt logic of a 9-year-old, "you're a really, really good clockmaker. And when the best clockmaker in town stops believing time should move, all the little machines just agree with him. Because they're listening to you the way a dog listens to its owner." Tobias looked at him for a long moment. "That's an absurd theory," he said. "Is it more absurd than anything else that's happened?" Tobias did not have an answer to that. "Why didn't you go out sooner?" Pim asked. He did not ask it cruelly. He asked it the way children ask the hardest questions. Directly, because they have not yet learned all the reasons adults avoid them. "Because going out sooner meant admitting something was wrong," said Tobias quietly. "As long as I sat here telling myself she was just late. Nothing bad had happened yet. The moment I stood up and reached for my coat, I had to admit I was afraid. And once I admitted that, I'd have to actually face the storm and the dark, and the river, and the very real chance I might find something terrible. So you waited because waiting felt safer." "Waiting felt like nothing had gone wrong yet," said Tobias. "Which wasn't the same as being safer. It just felt that way, for those hours, before I finally couldn't lie to myself any longer." Pim looked around again at the dozens of frozen clocks. "Considering this, I think," he said slowly, "maybe the clocks aren't stopped because you're sad. I think they're stopped because some part of you is still sitting in that chair, telling yourself, it's not too late to go out the door in time." The shop went very still. Stiller than usual, which was already very still indeed. "You're 9. said Tobias, his voice not quite steady. You shouldn't be able to say things like that. My dad died when I was 6, said Pim simply. I think about time a lot, too. About the version of that day where someone left 5 minutes earlier or later and everything turned out differently. I used to imagine I could find that other day, the better one, if I just thought about it hard enough. Did it work? No, said Pim. But I stopped trying to find it about a year ago. Not because I stopped wishing things were different. Just because I figured out that thinking about the better day that didn't happen was using up all the time I had for the actual days that were happening. Tobias set down the small disassembled clock very carefully, as though it might shatter. That's a very large thing to figure out at 8 years old, he said. I had practice, said Pim. Same as you're going to have to. Tobias did not answer that immediately. He stood and walked slowly to the shop's largest clock. A grandfather clock nearly as tall as the doorway, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. Its hands locked at 7 minutes past midnight, the same as every other clock in Hollowmere. He opened its glass face, reached inside. His hands, which had not done this kind of work in 8 years, moved with a strange combination of rustiness and old, deep familiarity. The way you never quite forget how to do the thing you were always best at, even after years of refusing to do it. I'm not doing this because I'm ready, he said, more to himself than to Pim. I want that understood. I don't think I'll ever feel ready. I think I'm doing this because a 9-year-old just told me I'm still sitting in a chair I need to stand up from, 8 years too late, and he's annoyingly correct about it. He pushed the pendulum. It swung, hesitant at first, one slow arc, then a pause, as though the mechanism itself wasn't certain it was allowed. Then it caught its rhythm. Tick. The sound was enormous in the silent shop. Pim felt it in his chest more than he heard it in his ears. Tick. Tobias stood with his hand still resting on the clock's wooden case, his face doing several complicated things at once. Grief and relief and a kind of terror that looked very much like the moment right before someone finally cries after holding it in for a very long time. It's still 7 past midnight on the dial, said Tobias quietly. I haven't moved the hands yet. I don't think I can do that part today. That's all right, said Pim. You don't have to fix the hands and the moving at the same time. My mum says you're allowed to do hard things in pieces. Tobias almost smiled. It looked unfamiliar on his face, like a coat that hadn't been worn in years and didn't quite fit the same way anymore. Outside, in the streets of Hollowmere, something extraordinary and quiet was happening. In the mill, the great clock's frozen hands gave a single, shuddering lurch, and then began, very slowly, to move again, though they had not yet reached 7 minutes past midnight, as if even they understood they were not yet permitted to pass that particular point. In the church tower, the old bell mechanism creaked, dust falling from gears that hadn't turned in 8 years, and began its slow climb back toward the hour. In houses up and down every street, mantel clocks and pocket watches that nobody had thought to throw away, even after giving up on them entirely, twitched back into motion. All of them stopped at the exact same point, all of them waiting together for permission to pass it. People stepped out onto their doorsteps, looking up at the church tower in confusion and a wonder they hadn't expected to feel about something so ordinary as a clock. No one understood exactly why. Only Tobias and Pim ever fully would. But word spread, the way it does in small towns, that the clockmaker on Cooper's Lane had finally opened his door. It took 3 more weeks before Tobias moved the hands on the grandfather clock past 7 minutes past midnight. He did it alone, early one morning, before the shop opened. Pim arrived an hour later to find the hands had shifted. Not far, just past the dreaded minute, into the ordinary, anonymous safety of 7 minutes past midnight, 1 second. You did it, said Pim. I did it badly, said Tobias. I cried for almost an hour first. I don't recommend it as a method. Did it help? Tobias considered this honestly, the way he had learned, in the past 3 weeks, to consider most of Pim's questions. It didn't fix anything, he said. I want to be clear about that, since you seem like the sort of person who'd notice if I exaggerated. Ren is still gone. That part doesn't get fixed by a clock moving forward. But I think I finally understand that the clock not moving was never actually protecting her, or me, or anyone. It was just one more thing the storm took, that I'd been quietly trying to give back to her by refusing to let it go. And now I think I'd rather spend whatever time I have left actually living in it, said Tobias. Instead of standing guard over the 1 minute I can't undo. By the end of that year, every clock in Hollowmere kept time again. Though several townspeople swore, with the kind of affection reserved for old eccentric habits, that the church bell rang the 7 o'clock hour just slightly louder than the others, every single evening, as if marking something the rest of the town had agreed not to mention out loud anymore either. Tobias reopened his shop fully. He took on a new apprentice the following spring, a careful, quiet girl who reminded him faintly of someone. In the particular way she held tiny gears up to the light to study them before fitting them into place. He did not pretend this was the same. He told her so directly, on her first day, in case she ever wondered why he sometimes grew quiet around certain small mechanisms. She said that was all right. She said she didn't need to be the same as anyone. She just wanted to learn how the small things worked. Pim still visited the shop most weeks, even though he was, by his own admission, hopeless with anything smaller than a doorknob. He liked, he said, the sound of all the clocks ticking slightly out of sync with each other. Not quite agreeing on the precise second, the way real time never quite agrees with itself across a whole town, across a whole life, across all the small broken moments people somehow keep carrying forward anyway. In Hollowmere, if you ask anyone old enough to remember, they'll tell you the town once stopped completely, for 8 long years, at 7 minutes past midnight. They won't always tell you why, but they'll tell you it started moving again because of a clockmaker who finally opened his door, and a boy who'd learned, far too young, that the unloved hours waiting on the other side of grief are the only ones anybody actually gets to keep.